Prescription products require completion of an online medication consultation with an independent healthcare provider through the LifeMD platform and are only available if prescribed. Subscription required. Individual results may vary. Additional restrictions apply at lifemd.com. Read all warnings before using GLP-1s. Side effects may include a risk of thyroid C-cell tumors. Do not use GLP-1s if you or your family have a history of thyroid cancer.
Should GLP-1 weight loss medication like Wegovy and Zepbound cost thousands of dollars? We don't think so. TryLifeMD.com helps provide insurance access to the leading GLP-1 medications. Visit TryLifeMD.com and check your eligibility for GLP-1 medication with copays as low as $0. Listen to Bridget's story after losing 55 pounds and using her insurance for coverage.
LifeMD helped me get covered with my insurance. Finding out that it was covered was huge. I've lost 55 pounds. I am so much healthier now that I've lost the weight. I would never be able to do it without them.
Get started today and check your eligibility for GLP-1 medication with copays as low as $0 at TryLifeMD.com. That's TryLifeMD.com.
Welcome back to another episode of Bloodstained Backstories. I'm your host, Jace.
And I'm your host, Summer.
Today's episode may have some content that is disturbing for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Jace, have you ever heard of Albert Fish?
I think I borrowed a cup of sugar from him one time.
Oh my God, well, at least it was sugar and not any meat byproducts. Okay, born on May 19th, 1870, he was given the name of Hamilton Howard Fish. He was an American serial killer, rapist, child molester, and cannibal.
Did he eat their livers with fava beans and some nice Chianti?
Well, Jace, to be honest, he claimed to have made roasts and stews with the meat, so you never know.
Sounds like a great dinner party to have.
Yep, exactly. Between July 1924 and June 1928, he committed at least 3 child murders. Fish was a suspect in at least 10 murders during his lifetime. He only confessed to 3 murders that the police were able to trace to a known homicide. Fish also confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people and bragging at one point that he had killed children in every state and said his number of victims was about 100. It is not known if his statement was truthful or if he was referring to rapes and cannibalism. Jace, this sounds like this is going to be a wild one.
It sure does. What a train through the body parts of a human being. Albert was born on May 9th, 1970 in Washington, D.C. His father was 43 years older than his mother, making him 75 at the time of Albert's birth. Well, at least his little swimmers were going strong. Albert was the youngest of 5 siblings, but only 2 lived, making him the youngest of 3. Well, I guess his little swimmers weren't so strong after all. He wished to be called Albert after a dead sibling.
That's a little bit strange in itself, but okay.
The family had a history of mental illness. He had an uncle that had mania. One of his brothers was confined in a state mental hospital. A half-brother suffered from schizophrenia, and his sister Anne received a diagnosis of mental affliction. His mother had oral and visual hallucinations, and 3 other relatives were diagnosed with mental illnesses. On October 16, 1875, Albert's father suffered a fatal heart attack. His mother put the kids in an orphanage where they were frequently abused. Albert began to enjoy the physical pain brought on by the beatings he received while in the orphanage. In 1880, Albert's mother started working a government job and was able to remove them from the orphanage.
Well, that was good that she was able to get them out, that she remembered she had them there and went and got them. Back then, a lot of the parents just left them in the orphanage. At age 12, which was in 1882, Albert started a relationship with a telegraph boy. The telegraph boy introduced him to such practices as drinking urine and eating feces. Albert then began going to public bathhouses so he could watch other boys undress. He was spending a great portion of his weekends on these visits. On and off throughout his life, Albert would write obscene letters to women. He required the names from classified ads and matrimonial agencies. At the age of 20, in 1890, Albert moved to New York City. While there, he engaged in male prostitution and began raping and molesting little boys, most under the age of 6. Albert's mother arranged a marriage for him in 1898 to Anna Marie Hoffman, who was 9 years older than him. They had 6 children together, 4 boys and 2 girls. In 1903, Albert was arrested for grand larceny. He was convicted and incarcerated in Sing Sing prison.
Sometime later, Albert recounted an incident in which a male lover took him to a wax museum. He was totally fascinated by the bisection of the human penis and became obsessed with sexual mutilation. Around 1910, Albert was working in Delaware, and he met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Bedden. The two began a sadomasochist relationship. It is unclear, though, whether the sadomasochism was consensual on Thomas's part. Albert later admitted that Thomas was intellectually disabled. He eventually took Thomas to an old farmhouse where he tortured him for over 2 weeks. Albert eventually tied him up and cut off half his penis. Albert later recalled that I will never forget the scream or the way he looked at me. His original intention was to kill Thomas, cut him up, and take him home. The weather was hot, and Albert feared that with it being so hot, it would draw attention. So he poured peroxide over the wound, wrapped it in Vaseline, a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, left him $10, and kissed him goodbye. He later recalled, I took the first train back home and never went back to him or found out what happened to him.
I did try to find out something about Thomas, and I couldn't find any record or any information on him. I wonder if he made it. I wonder if he had it sewn back on like Bobbit. January 1917, Albert's wife left him for a handyman who had stayed with the family. Albert was forced to raise his children as a single parent. He told the newspaper that when his wife left him, she took nearly every possession the family owned. Albert began to have auditory hallucinations. At one time, he wrapped himself in a carpet saying he was following the instructions of John the Apostle. At about this time is when Albert began to indulge in self-harm. He would embed needles into his groin and abdomen. After his arrest, x-rays that were taken showed that Albert had at least 29 needles lodged in his pelvic region. Another thing he would do was to repeatedly hit himself with a nail and studded paddle. He would also insert wool that was doused with lighter fluid into his anus and set it on fire.
Wouldn't doing that give him like second-degree burns or something? I
would
wonder how he avoided getting an infection or whatever, but that raises so many questions.
It sure does. I mean, Albert never attacked or abused his children, but the one thing he did do was to encourage them and their friends to paddle his buttocks with a nail-studded paddle.
That is weird even by today's standards. Can you imagine that happening in the early 1900s? Hey, let's go over to your house and play a game of Monopoly and paddle your father. Sounds like a gay old time, right?
That's wow.
In Georgetown, around 1919, Albert stabbed an intellectually disabled boy. Albert often chose his victims that were mentally disabled or African American, explaining that he assumed these people would not be missed when they were killed. Later on, Albert claimed that sometimes he paid boys to get other children for him. Albert would then torture, mutilate, and murder the children with his implements from hell, a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, or a handsaw. On July 11th, 1924, Albert found a little girl named Beatrice Keel, who was 8 years old, playing alone on her parents' farm in Staten Island. Albert offered her money to help him look for some rhubarb. Beatrice was about to leave with Albert when her mother chased Albert away. Albert did leave, but he later came back and hid in the Keel's barn trying to get some sleep. He was discovered by the girl's father and chased away once again. At 54 years of age in 1924, Albert, suffering from psychosis, felt that God was commanding him to torture and sexually mutilate children.
Albert attempted to test his implements of hell on a 10-year-old that he had been molesting, named Cyril Quinn. Cyril was outside playing ball with a friend when Albert asked them if they had eaten lunch. When they replied no, he invited them into his apartment for sandwiches. While the children were wrestling on the bed, the mattress moved, and they discovered a knife, a small handsaw, and a meat cleaver. They got scared and ran from the apartment.
If they were so scared, why didn't they tell someone when they ran away?
That's a good question. I don't know, maybe they were afraid of getting in trouble for being in the apartment. Albert never divorced his first wife, but even though he was still married to her, he married Estella Wilcox on February 6, 1930 in New York. They divorced, ready for this, after only a week.
They were married in less time than Kim Kardashian.
Yeah, they were. In May of 1930, Albert was arrested for sending an obscene letter to a woman who answered an ad for a maid. Following that arrest and another in 1931, Albert was sent to Bellevue Hospital for observation.
Albert saw a classified ad on May 25, 1928 in a Sunday newspaper that read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in the country. Edward Budd, West 15th Street." Albert was 58 years old when on May 28th he visited the Budd family in Manhattan using the pretenses that he was going to hire Edward. Albert was a farmer from Farmingdale, New York, and his name was Frank Howard. He promised he would hire Bud and his friend and that he would send them in a few days. Albert sent a telegram when he didn't show up and apologized to the family and set a later date. Albert did return about a day later to meet the Edwards' little sister Grace Budd, who was 10 years old. Albert's attention then shifted towards Grace. Thinking quickly, Albert made up a story about having to attend his niece's birthday party, and he persuaded her parents to let Grace accompany him to the party that evening. Albert took Grace to an abandoned house he had previously picked out for use of the murder of his next victim. He mutilated and strangled Grace to death, and then decapitated and dismembered her body. He ate most of her remains over the next several days. The police arrested a man named Charles Pope after his estranged wife accused him of the crime. He would spend 108 days in jail for the arrest and trial on December 22nd, 1930, and was found not guilty.
An anonymous letter was sent to Grace's parents in November 1934, and that led police to talk to Albert. Grace's mom was illiterate, so she had her son read it to her. The unaltered letter reads, "My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine, Captain John Davis, shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and two others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At the time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go into any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of a naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body, and sold as a veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole two boys, one 7 and one 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked, and tied them in a closet, then burned everything that they had on. Several times a day and night, he would spank them and torture them to make their meat good and tender. First, he killed the 11-year-old boy because he had the fattest ass and, of course, the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except for the head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven, all of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, and stewed. The little boy was next and went the same way. At the same time, I was living on East 100th Street. He told me often how good human flesh was. I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, January 3rd, 1928, I called on you at West 15th Street. I brought you strawberries and fresh creamy pot cheese from my farm. We had lunch. Grace sat on my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind then to eat her. On the pretense of taking her to a party that you said yes she could go to, that was your mistake. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain inside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all of my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though. I could have if I had wished. She died a virgin.
Police did investigate the letter. The story concerning Captain Davis and the famine in Hong Kong could not be verified.
There was a famine in parts of China around 1894, and there had been reports about cannibalism, but that it has never been totally verified, and further research would need to be done on that situation.
But part of the letter about the murder of Grace was found to be accurate as far as its description of the kidnapping and the events that happened. It was impossible to confirm whether Albert had eaten parts of Grace's body or not. The letter that was delivered to Grace's mother was in an envelope that had a small hexagonal emblem with the letters NYPCBA. Those letters represented the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. A janitor that worked for the company told police that he did make some of the stationery at home, but that when he moved out of the rooming, he left it behind. The police went to the rooming house to check out this story. The landlady told police that Albert checked out of the room a few days earlier and that his son sent him some money, and he did ask her to hold his next check for him. The chief investigator of the case waited outside the room until Albert returned. Albert did agree to go to the headquarters for questioning. At this point, Albert brandished a razor blade, but the investigators disarmed him and took him to the police headquarters. Albert did attempt to deny the murder of Grace Budd. He told police that he meant to go to the house to kill the brother, Edward. Albert also told police that it never entered his mind to rape her, but later on told his attorney that while kneeling on Grace's chest and strangling her, he did have 2 involuntary ejaculations. This information was used in the trial to make the claim of the kidnapping was sexually motivated and thus avoiding the mention of cannibalism.
After Albert's arrest, additional crimes were discovered on July 14, 1924. Francis McDonald, who was 9 years old at the time, was reported missing when he did not return home from playing with some friends in Port Richmond, Staten Island. People started searching for him, and his body was found, hanging by a tree in a wooded area near his home. He had been sexually assaulted and strangled by his suspenders. His autopsy revealed that he had also suffered extensive lacerations to his legs and abdomen. His left hamstring had almost been entirely stripped of its flesh. At first, Albert refused to claim responsibility for his death, but later Albert stated that he intended to castrate the boy, but fled when he heard someone approaching the area. The boy's friends told the police that he was taken by an elderly man with a gray mustache. A neighbor also reported that he had seen the boy with a similar-looking man walking along a grassy path in the woods. The boy's mother said she saw the same man earlier that day. The McDonald murder remained unsolved until the murder of Grace Budd. Several eyewitnesses positively identified Albert as the odd stranger seen around Port Richmond on the day of McDonald's disappearance. One of those witnesses was Hans Keel, the man who chased Albert away when he caught him sleeping in his barn. The Richmond District Attorney announced his intentions to seek an indictment against Albert for Francis McDonald's murder. Albert at first denied the charges. It wasn't until March 1935 that the conclusion of this trial for Grace Budd and his confessions to the killing of Billy Gaffney, which he admitted to the rape and murder of McDonald. When Albert's confession was made public, a local newspaper wrote that the disclosure solidified Albert's reputation as the most vicious child slayer in criminal history.
On February 11, 1927, 3-year-old Bully Beaton, his 12-year-old brother, and a 4-year-old, Billy Gaffey, were playing in the hallway of the apartment that they lived in, located in Brooklyn. The 12-year-old left and went back to his apartment, and the two younger boys disappeared. Beaton was found later on the roof of the apartment building, but Gaffney was nowhere to be found. When police asked little Beaton what happened to Gaffney, he replied, "The boogeyman took him." Gaffney's body was never found. A motorman on the Brooklyn trolley saw a picture of Albert in the newspaper and identified him as the old man he saw on February 11, 1927. He stated that the man was trying to quiet a little boy who was sitting on the trolley with him. The boy was not wearing a jacket and was crying for his mother. Albert dragged the little boy off the trolley. Beaton's description of the boogeyman matched that of Albert. Police then matched the description of the child to Billy Gaffey. Detectives were able to establish that Albert was working as a house painter on February 1927 and that he was working only a few miles from where the boys were abducted. Billy's mother visited Albert when he was incarcerated at Sing Sing. He was accompanied by the detective that worked the case. She wanted to ask Albert about her son's death. Albert refused to speak to her, but he did write a letter to his attorney. "I brought him to the Riker Avenue dumps. There is a house that stands alone, not far from where I took him. I took the G-boy there, stripped him naked, tied his hands and feet, and gagged him with a piece of a dirty rag I picked out of the dump. Then I burned his clothes. I threw his shoes in the dump. Then I walked back to the trolley to 59th Street at 2 a.m. and walked home from there. The next day, about 2 p.m., I took the tolls, a good heavy cat nine tails, homemade, short handle, cut one of my belts in half, slit these half in 6 strips about 8 inches long. I whipped his bare behind till blood ran down from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged his eyes, and he was dead then. I stuck a knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. I picked up 4 old potato sacks and gathered a pile of stones. Then I cut him up. I had a grip with me. I put his nose, his ears, and slices of his belly in the grip. Then I cut him through the middle of the body, just below his belly button, then through his legs 2 inches below behind. I put this in my grip with a lot of paper. I cut off his head, feet, arms, hands, and the legs below the knee. This I put in the sacks weighted with stones, tied to the ends of them, and threw them in the pool of slimy water you will see along the road going to North Beach. The water is 3 to 4 feet deep. They sank at once. I came home with my meat. I had the front of the body I liked best, his monkey and peewees, and a nice little fat behind the roast in the oven. I made stew out of his ears, nose, and pieces of his face and belly. I put onions, carrots, turnips, celery, and salt and pepper. It was good. Then I split the cheeks of his behind open, cut off his monkey and peewees, and washed them first. I put strips of bacon on each of the cheeks behind and put them in the oven. Then I picked 4 onions, and when meat had roasted about a fourth of an hour, I poured about a pint of water over it and gravy and put the onions. At frequent intervals, I basted his behind with a wooden spoon so the meat would be nice and juicy. In about 2 hours, it was nice and brown, cooked through. I never ate any roast turkey that tasted half as good as his fat little behind did. I ate every bit of meat in the 4 days. His little monkey was sweet as nut, but peewees I could not chew. I threw them in the toilet.
Seriously, as a parent, I would want closure on what happened to my child, but I don't think as a parent I would want to know all those details that he gave. That was way too TMI. The Richmond County District Attorney announced his intentions to seek an indictment against Alfred for Francis McDonald's murder. Albert at first denied the charges. It wasn't until March 1935 that after the conclusion of his trial for Grace Budd that his confession to killing of little Billy Gaffney and he admitted to the rape and murder of McDonald. When Albert's confession was made public, a local newspaper wrote that the disclosure solidified Albert's reputation as the most vicious child slayer in criminal history. Albert's trial for the murder of Grace Budd lasted 10 days. Albert did plead insanity. He claimed he heard voices from God telling him to kill the children. Several psychiatrists testified about Albert's sexual fetishes, which included sadism and masochism, the derivation of pleasure from acts of respectively inflicting pain or humiliation, flagellation, the act of beating a human body with such things as whips, rods, switches, etc., exhibitionism, the act of exposing intimate parts of the body in a public or semi-public place, voyeurism, the sexual interest in or practicing of watching other people engaged in intimate behaviors such as undressing, sexual activity, or other private activity. Picarism, sexual interest in penetrating the skin of another person with soft objects. Cannibalism, the act or practice of humans eating the flesh or internal organs of other human beings. Coprophagia, simply put, is the consumption of feces. Urophilia, sexual excitement associated with urine. Hematologia, sexual interest in objects, situations, or individuals that are atypical. Pedophilia, a psychiatric disorder in which an adult or older adolescent has sexual attraction to prepubescent children. Necrophilia, sexual attraction or acts involving corpses. And infibulation, the ritual removal of the vulva and its suturing. Albert's defense counsel noted that Albert was a psychiatric phenomenon and that nowhere in legal or medical records was there another individual who possessed so many sexual abnormalities.
The defense chief expert witness was a psychiatrist with an emphasis on child development. During 2 days of testimony, he tried to explain Albert's obsession with religion and specifically his preoccupation with the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. He told the court that Albert believed that sacrificing a boy would be penance for his own sins and that even if the act itself was wrong, angels would prevent it if God did not approve. Albert attempted to sacrifice once before, but stopped when a car drove past. Edward Budd was the next intended victim, but he was larger than expected, and so he settled on Grace. He knew Grace was a female, but it is believed that Albert perceived her body as a boy. In Albert's mind, his cannibalism and association with communion, in a statement with 1,500 words long, detail Albert's life and ended with the doctors being asked how he is considered Albert's medical condition based on his life. His answer was simple: he is insane.
The first of four rebuttal witnesses were Menius Gregory, the former manager of the Bellevue Hospital where Albert was treated during 1930. He testified that Albert was abnormal but sane. Under cross-examination, Dempsey asked if coprophilia, urophilia, and pedophilia indicated a sane or insane person. Gregory replied that such a person was not mentally sick and that these were common perversions that are socially perfectly all right, and that Albert was no different from millions of other people, some very, very prominent and successful, who had the very same perversions. Another was Albert's 17-year-old stepdaughter. She told how Albert taught her and her brothers and sisters several games involving overtones of masochism and child molestation.
The jurors did not doubt that Albert was insane, but they felt that he should be executed anyways. They found him to be sane and guilty. The judge sentenced him to death by electrocution. Albert arrived at prison in March 1935 and he was executed on January 16, 1936 in the electric chair at Sing Sing. He was buried in the Sing Sing prison cemetery. It was said that Albert helped the electrocutioner position the electrodes on his body. His last words were said to be, "I don't even know why I'm here." Albert's lawyer held a meeting with reporters after the execution. His lawyer revealed that he had his client's final statement. It was several pages of handwritten notes that Albert penned in the hours prior to his death. The reporters pressed him to reveal the document's contents. The lawyer refused, stating, "I will never show it to anyone. It is the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read."
It will never be known the true count of Albert's victims, but it is believed there are many more than what he was charged for. Between 1924 and 1928, We know he killed at least 3 children. Francis McDonald, 8, on July 15, 1924, in Long Island, New York. Billy Gaffney, 4, February 11, 1927, New York City. And Grace Budd, 10, New York City. There were the murders of Yetta Abramowitz, 12. She was strangled and beaten on the roof of a 5-story apartment building in the Bronx. She died in the hospital shortly after she was found. A man who has gone unidentified, but matching Albert's description, was sighted trying to lure several local girls into dark hallways and alleys on the date of her death. Then there was the mutilated body of a 16-year-old Mary Ellen O'Connor, whose remains were found in the woods close to a house that Albert had been painting in Far Rockaway, Queens, in February 15, 1932. Then last we have the possible victims. Albert did claim to have sexually assaulted at least 100 boys. The true count we will never know. Who knows, maybe Albert himself did not even know. But it is possible that he was responsible for Emma Richardson's death, 5 years old, on October 3rd, 1926, and Benjamin Collins, age 17, December 15th, 1932.
Back in those days, parents let their children, even as young as 5, go out and play unsupervised. Everyone trusted everybody else. It would not have been unusual to see 2 or 3 kids walking into the candy store without their parent. Thanks for tuning in to Bloodstained Backstories. Don't forget to follow us on social media to stay updated, share your thoughts, and connect with fellow crime enthusiasts. You can catch us anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or your go-to platform. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Join us next week as we uncover another chilling case. Until then, stay safe and stay curious.